Hello, my name is Brionne Janae, and I am going to read poems to you guys for the next 15 minutes for the Badmouth Poetry Series. Badmouth Poetry Series, yes. Thank you to Rebecca Aronson for inviting me to read and for organizing all of this and for making sure this little video of me in my room reading poems makes it out into the world. So here I go. Love poem to the drywall in Brionne's apartment. Tell me what it's like to be white and worth saving, to know the law was dreamed up to protect and not police you. Spare me your guilt. I'm sure you must have loved her, as we can't help but love what returns to us over and over again. Do you replay your favorite moments, her favorite songs loud and vibrating through paint, the bass insistent as a heartbeat pressed against the ear? Do you miss her, her fingertips digging in as she leans to adjust her shoe? What do you know of flesh, of how a bullet enters and bleeds, of how some women have no right to protection? I'm sure you thought it'd be the same for you too, that you had both received and would both receive justice. Tell me, how long did you sit empty before they patched the holes? And who, if anyone, are you holding now? He made me feel like a drug addict. Dr. Susan Moore. When he went in to have the cancer cut from his liver, Pa was so afraid of the nurses and what they might do to his black body, Mo had to sleep on the small cot beside his bed all 3 nights while they waited to see how he'd do with the invasion. I was in high school, and he had spent all summer before the surgery saying how glad he'd be for a break from Molly. And when he couldn't bear the idea of being alone with his gaping wound in that white space, I told myself after all this time he was still a boy from the backwoods of Mississippi who'd never seen a reason to trust a white man in his life. I can't understand why white women are so willing to leave their children with strangers. I was babysitting once, and a woman I'd only just met handed me her sobbing toddler and walked away. I wanted to cry too. When I was a kid, my aunt complained about the nice white teacher who loved her daughter too much. I swear she's just gonna run off with my baby, she'd say. No one ever wants to talk about how close we are to the legacy of enslavement, but it's right there. You just choose not to look. Even in a viral pandemic that destroys the lungs, the error rate for oximeters is 3 times higher for dark-skinned patients, a product of whites-only studies, a flaw discovered 15 years ago that no one cares to fix. I've decided I can't trust anyone who uses darkness as a metaphor for what they fear. On my way into the hospital, when I was singing about my rape and begging to go home, the man in charge of the ward looked at me like a thing to be got under control, and I knew then I had been outside of my mind to go there in my need and think anyone might help me. I think I decided to get all of the heavy poems out of the way in the beginning. And that's a lie, because I think they might all be heavy except for the last one. That's okay, you can pause and take breaks. All right, so the next one is titled from a quote from a poem, with a quote from a poem by Toy Derricott. So it's called Say It Wasn't My Fault, You Suffered. Head anchored between your hip bones, nudging the cervix from the inside, days the long and weary task of opening, and me all too big from the start. Mother, in another era I would have killed us both. Must I alone be blamed? I know the crease of the scar creeping up your belly, how after my brothers were pulled limb by limb from that same crater, you cradled the wound so gingerly I worried you might split apart. Mother, you don't have to forgive me. I know what it's like to refuse and still be opened. There is nothing more isolating than a body. Acutely, the lines come down around us. We each trapped in our own peculiar cells, unknowable one to the other. We spend all our lives learning to read the pinch and crinkle of the skin, the limbs' gesture, heads' every particular angle. We may as well be divining stars. Even without gods, we beg manna and milk to be told where to go and what to do and how to bear the yoke of our bewilderment. Please, Mother, we say, tell me what you mean. So, this next poem is quite long. It is the title poem of my forthcoming manuscript, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, which won Cave Khanum's second book prize, which is how it's going to go out into the world. So as always, thank you to Cave Khanum for making that happen for me. This book is important. That book is very important to me because one of the things it circles and attempts to understand and make peace with is the reality that my paternal grandfather is a child molester who I grew up with, who assaulted his daughter and who assaulted me. At the time that I wrote this poem and at the time that I wrote that book, I was very much living in denial. I think maybe I'll read a poem that sort of addresses that before I get into this one, maybe. Yeah, I will. So now I'll read this poem that sort of addresses this issue of denial, and then I will read the title poem of the new manuscript, and after that long piece maybe end with something a little more upbeat. Yeah. All right, so it's called Sometimes You Can Stare and Stare at a Thing and Never See What It Is. You hate rats. They remind you of something you can't or won't place. The city is full of rats. You don't walk after sundown to avoid them. You stomp your feet down dark alleys so they have time to scamper away. Mostly you put them so far out of your mind you forget they exist until you see one darting from a trash pile. Your friend has to say, rat trap, before you see the black boxes littered all over Brooklyn. Sometimes it's trickier, like with the rat you couldn't avoid on the walk from the train in Boston, so you named him Ralph and said, hello, Ralph, every night on your walk home. One day Ralph got smashed by a tire, something tasty in the road, and he forgot to run. You don't look too closely at his remains, but remember how shocked you were to see the other rat puttering around his body. How you had only made peace with the solitary rodent and not the dense, inevitable infestation. All right, and I'll read the title poem of the new manuscript. Blessed Are the Peacemakers. That's what it's called. Blessed are the peacemakers. It has an epigraph. Lord, teach me to bridle my tongue. You don't tell your father what you know of his father, though he has held this truth since long before your infant cries taught him to make a cradle of his arms. What would you even say? I cannot go with you to your father's house. Daddy, your father has been the shadow pressing at the necks of far too many women. Think of your sister. It is a choice to bridle the tongue, to play the saint, the peacemaker. Pray you aren't blessed for it, for kissing the shadow's gray cheek, for your weakness, for your father's sake, for all that you know. Kneel before the silenced women and beg. Be forgiven. Be cursed. Your father says Grandpa stopped coming for Christmas because of you. It is not an accusation, but rather a statement of fact. I kept my father from our home because he makes you uncomfortable. It's been 5 years since the fracture, and this is the first you and your father ever speak of it. You want this to be enough, but it is not. I kept my father from our home because he is a child molester, or I believe my sister, so how can it be? 2 winters ago, on the way home from gambling and at Indian casinos and calling it charity, somewhere in fire country where the mountains slope steeper than a girl's strangled scream and the wind slips through dry grass with the hush of prayer, Daddy suggests you drop by his father's house because it is on the way, because you haven't seen him in years, because what reason could you have to stay away for so long anyway? Your mother agrees, and your silence is consent. Grandpa's house is red and innocent as a barn with lemons growing in the yard. He offers to pick some for you, and you let him. He smiles, and you make yourself amenable, flash your teeth, as if everything were well. You can never outlive this, just as you cannot deny the subtext of your father's words, the plea in them deft as the undercurrent of the river you thrash about in panic, as if you'd never learned to swim, as if this were the origin of the saying, blood is thicker, taste the iron in your cheeks and remember, I kept our father from our home because I'm afraid you may divorce me too. You will never divorce your father, just as he will never divorce his. Whatever your father sins, they remain within the limits of grace. You try to explain this to him, but somewhere in Memphis, a congregation is celebrating the sins of their pastor, his little sexual incident with a teenager, trip away from the path of righteousness. Even at this distance, you cannot help but hear the roar of the saints. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Let the mouths of children groan, and children grown to women, and children grown to men be filled to the brim with uncast rock, their teeth ground down from the friction, their throats sealed off, suffocated. You are trying to clear the stone, to feel its weight at the center of your palm, to pull your arm back and let it fly like a bullet towards the skull of Goliath or an arrow into the heart of what hurts you. You are trying to let it fly as if its target was not the flesh of a man you too had grown up loving. From above, reality must look like an ocean rushing in, to thrash, to flood, to drag you bodily down. Your grandmother tells you she wishes she could have gone to the local pastor's funeral, but you can only witness the men who lost their youth beneath the hands of the Father. You hope they are relieved by his death, want to believe a person can be released from the worst of their life as an animal can scrape dead skin against the bark of a tree and be loosed from it. If only it were so simple. If only we could carry the memory of what was stolen like a second heavier skin to be shed at the end of winter. Is it always winter? Your grandmother says Auntie ought to give up dysfunction and move on, as if it's that easy. When you are not careful, you too find yourself searching for a way out into delusion, as if it could sustain you. Walk too far on those sands and they will swallow you. There must be limits to grace, no matter how desperately you pray that there aren't. Peace is never priceless nor easy. Remember that. Remember when your grandmother told you the story of Philip Bliss, how God took everything and he still declared it well, how you worried you never walk in that kind of grace. You are too much discontent. You will always feel the winds whipping the waves, the water burning in your chest. Don't resist it. Pray there is freedom for Auntie and the flutter of truth falling from her lips like rain. Pray for flood. Pray grace is strength to speak. Pray grace is strength to speak when everything says be silent. Let her never speak alone. Say it too. It is not well. It is not well. It is not well. It is not well. Find your peace, but find your peace here. All right. Whew, that was a lot. A lot to read. All right, I'm going to close with another new poem. And I just want to thank Badmouth again for having me, and for you guys for listening, whoever listens. Thanks for coming on this journey with me. So this next poem takes its title from a Parliament song called Mothership. And so the title is Swing Down, Sweet Chariot, Stop and Let Me Ride, which is sort of a reworking of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And so this poem is an imagining of, what if my ancestors, what if the enslaved folk what if enslaved Black Americans were really, calling for the mothership, whatever that it was, to sort of come save them. And so, here's this poem. Swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let me ride. And when the mothership descends, having traveled back through time to collect the people from where they called out in the fields, and the Martians or God blast a bop from the craft's almighty intergalactic speakers, so the soul heard the answer long before the ear. Here I am, the pilot says, here I am, come forth, I'll carry you home. And when hearing the people stooped, and when hearing the people stopped where they toiled and walked off, they entered the ship running and gleeful, lingering only briefly to swing on their torturers. You should have seen them, cake walking onto the ship, covered in the overseer's blood, doing the Tootsie Roll and shaking everything their mama gave them, all the remaining teeth shining in their mouths and their eyes only moments from seeing the stars. Thank you guys for being here with me.